The Messed Up Origins of Alan Watts. You think you know Alan Watts, the voice of Eastern wisdom for the Western world. The man who taught millions how to let go and live in the present moment. The philosophical guru who made Zen Buddhism accessible to Americans, searching for meaning in the 1960s and 70s. His books sold in the millions. His lectures filled auditoriums. His radio broadcasts reached households across the nation. He was, by all accounts, the bridge between ancient Eastern philosophy and modern American consciousness. But what if I told you that the man who spent decades teaching people about non-attachment died, surrounded by the wreckage of 3 destroyed marriages, 7 abandoned children, and a houseboat littered with empty bottles? What if the guru of being present was so absent from his own family that some of his kids didn't even know where he lived? What if the philosopher who preached simplicity demanded 5-star hotels, luxury accommodations, and fees that would make modern motivational speakers blush? November of 1973, Sausalito, California. A houseboat floating in the bay. Inside, Alan Watts, 68 years old, dying alone. No wife present. No children by his side. Just scattered manuscripts, unpaid bills, and the bitter residue of a life lived in complete contradiction to everything he publicly claimed to believe. The cause of death would be listed as heart complications. But the reality was far more complex, far more tragic, and far more revealing about the man behind the golden mask. This is the story that his devoted followers don't want to examine too closely. This is the chapter that gets conveniently edited out of the glowing retrospectives and tribute documentaries. Because acknowledging it means confronting an uncomfortable truth. That one of the 20th century's most influential spiritual teachers was in his personal life a walking contradiction. A man who could eloquently explain the concept of living authentically, while simultaneously performing one of the most elaborate acts of spiritual theater in modern history. 3 marriages, 7 children, decades of documented substance dependency masked as spiritual exploration. Affairs that destroyed families. Financial demands that contradicted every principle of detachment he preached. And through it all, an increasingly desperate performance, as if he knew the mask was slipping but couldn't afford to let it fall. But this didn't start in that houseboat in South. The seeds of this contradiction were planted decades earlier, across an ocean, in a young man who was less interested in enlightenment and far more interested in being seen as enlightened. The construction of Alan Watts, the persona, began long before most people knew his name. And understanding how that persona was built is essential to understanding how spectacularly it would eventually collapse. So let's go back. Back before the fame, before the lectures, before the books that would make him a household name. Back to when Alan Watts was just an ambitious young man with a gift for words and an insatiable hunger for recognition that no amount of Eastern philosophy could ever truly satisfy. England in the 1930s. A teenage Alan Watts, barely 16 years old, already cultivating an image, not of a spiritual seeker, mind you, but of an intellectual prodigy who happened to be fascinated by Eastern mysticism. This distinction matters, because from the very beginning, Watts wasn't drawn to Buddhism or Taoism for inner peace or enlightenment. He was drawn to it because it made him interesting. It made him stand out. It made people pay attention. And Alan Watts craved attention the way other men craved wealth or power. By his early 20s, he'd positioned himself as an expert on Zen Buddhism, despite never having studied formally in Japan, never having undergone traditional training, never having been formally recognized by any legitimate Zen lineage. But he had something more valuable than credentials. He had charisma. He had a voice that could make complex philosophical concepts sound accessible, and he had an uncanny ability to perform the role of mystic in a way that Western audiences found irresistible. The carefully chosen clothing that suggested Eastern influence without being costume. The way he'd pause before answering questions, as if consulting some deep well of wisdom. The deliberate cultivation of an accent that sounded more refined, more worldly than his actual middle-class British upbringing would suggest. In 1938, at 23 years old, Watts made a decision that would establish a pattern for the rest of his life. He married Eleanor, an American woman he'd met through mutual friends in the Buddhist community. She was sweet, devoted, genuinely spiritual, in a way that didn't require performance or audience. Within months of the wedding, Eleanor was pregnant with their daughter, Joan, and within months of learning about the pregnancy, Watts was already planning his escape. Not from the marriage, technically, just from England, from responsibility, from anything that might anchor him to a reality less glamorous than the one he was constructing in his mind. He told Eleanor it was about opportunity. America was where the real intellectual scene was happening. America was where he could make a name for himself. America was where a young man with his talents could actually build something significant. What he didn't tell her was that he'd already made arrangements to leave her behind. That the plan was never to bring her over later, as he promised. That she would raise Joan alone, while he reinvented himself 3,000 miles away, free from the inconvenient reality of being a husband and father. The abandonment was calculated, deliberate, and dressed up in the language of spiritual necessity. "I must follow my path," he wrote to friends, with no apparent irony. Eleanor understands that authentic living sometimes requires difficult choices. Eleanor, struggling to feed an infant on her own, while Watts sent sporadic checks that barely covered rent, did not, in fact, understand. But by then, he was already in New York, already networking, already building the persona that would make him famous. And it was in America, in the early 1940s, that the mask truly took shape. Watts understood something crucial about the American spiritual marketplace. People didn't want actual Buddhism with its discipline, its difficulty, its demands for genuine transformation. They wanted Buddhism that felt good. Buddhism that didn't require them to change too much. Buddhism that could be consumed like entertainment, like therapy, like a product that made them feel more evolved, without actually evolving. And Watts could deliver that product better than anyone. He started giving lectures, small groups at first, in living rooms and community centers. But the crowds grew. Because Watts had figured out the formula. He would take genuinely profound Eastern concepts, strip away anything that felt too demanding or uncomfortable, and repackage them as permission slips for Western individualism. Let go of attachment became don't stress about your job. Be present in the moment. Became stop worrying and enjoy yourself. The ego is an illusion became don't take yourself so seriously. It was Buddhism as self-help, Taoism as lifestyle brand. And America couldn't get enough. By 1950, Watts had married again. This time to Dorothy, a woman from a wealthy Connecticut family, with connections to New York's intellectual elite. Dorothy wasn't just a wife. She was access. Access to funding, to social circles, to the kind of legitimacy that a working-class British immigrant, without formal credentials, desperately needed. Together, they would have 4 children. Tina, Mark, Richard, and Lila. 4 more human beings who would learn, eventually, what it meant to be related to a man whose most authentic relationship was with his own carefully constructed image. The pattern was set. The mask was perfected. And behind it, already, the contradictions were piling up like unpaid debts that would eventually come due. The 1950s marked Alan Watts' ascension to genuine celebrity status in American intellectual circles. His books were selling. His lectures were drawing hundreds, sometimes thousands of attendees. Universities were inviting him to speak. Radio stations were offering him regular slots. He was becoming, in the public imagination, exactly what he'd always wanted to be. The voice of Eastern wisdom in the West, the translator of ancient truths for modern seekers, the philosopher who could make the mysterious accessible. But inside the home he shared with Dorothy and their 4 children, a very different story was unfolding. One that his growing audience would never see, never suspect, and certainly never reconcile with the gentle, smiling guru they heard on the radio. Dorothy's private letters, discovered decades later by researchers, paint a devastating picture. A woman trapped in a marriage to a man who was only fully present when there was an audience to perform for. He can spend 3 hours discussing compassion with strangers at a dinner party, she wrote to her sister in 1953, but cannot spend 30 minutes asking his own children about their day. The letters describe a pattern of emotional absence so profound that the children learned early not to expect their father to show up for the moments that mattered. Mark, the eldest son, would later recall in interviews that his father missed every single one of his childhood birthdays. Not because Watts was traveling for work, but because even when he was home, he was sequestered in his study, writing about the importance of being present, while his actual family existed like ghosts in the same house. The public Watts preached non-attachment. The private Watts was deeply attached to comfort, luxury, recognition, and control. He demanded specific accommodations for speaking engagements. Hotels had to meet certain standards. Meals had to be prepared certain ways. He developed a reputation among event organizers as someone who talked beautifully about simplicity, but whose contract writers suggested anything but simple needs. And the money he made from these appearances, substantial for the era, rarely made it back to Dorothy and the children. Instead, it funded a lifestyle that was becoming increasingly dependent on alcohol, which Watts had begun to frame not as a problem, but as a spiritual practice. Wine is a sacrament, he would tell friends, as he worked his way through bottle after bottle. Consciousness alteration is how we break free from the prison of ordinary perception. Then came Jeanette, 22 years old, a student who attended one of his lectures at a community center in San Francisco. Beautiful, impressionable, genuinely drawn to the philosophy he espoused. Within weeks of meeting her, Watts had initiated an affair. Within months, he made a decision that would shatter his second family just as completely as he abandoned his first. In 1955, he left Dorothy and their 4 children, the youngest barely 3 years old, to pursue this new relationship. He framed it, of course, in spiritual terms. One must follow the authentic path, he explained to mutual friends who questioned the decision. Staying in a marriage that no longer serves growth is its own form of dishonesty. The authentic path, apparently, led directly away from the 4 children, who would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand why their father's philosophy of universal love somehow didn't extend to them. The relationship with Jeanette lasted less than 2 years. But in that time, Watts had already met his third wife, Mary, a devoted follower who attended his workshops and believed, genuinely, that she was meeting an enlightened being. They married in 1957. She was convinced that the problems with Dorothy had been situational, that with the right partner, Watts could finally live in alignment with his teachings. Their daughter, Diane, was born in 19, and Mary discovered, far too late, that she simply stepped into a recurring role in a play that Watts had been performing his entire adult life. The script never changed. Only the actresses. By the early 1960s, something was breaking down in Watts himself. The performance was becoming harder to maintain. Friends from that period describe a man who drank constantly, not socially but compulsively, who would disappear for days without explanation, who showed up to speaking engagements visibly impaired, but somehow still managed to deliver lectures that audiences found profound. There's a documented incident from 1962, at a small gathering in Berkeley, where Watts, several drinks deep, broke character completely. "You want to know the truth?" he said to the stunned audience. "I'm making all of this up as I go. The cosmic consciousness, the universal oneness, the whole beautiful package. And you're eating it up because you need to believe there's someone who has the answers. But I don't have them. I'm just better at sounding like I do." The room apparently went silent. Some people left. Others laughed nervously, assuming it was some kind of Zen teaching moment, a deliberate provocation designed to shake them out of complacency. But people close to Watts knew better. It wasn't a teaching, it was a crack in the mask. A moment when the exhaustion of maintaining the performance for decades finally overwhelmed his ability to keep pretending. And then, like any skilled performer, he recovered, laughed it off, turned it into a philosophical point about the nature of authenticity and performance. The show continued, but the moment revealed something essential. Alan Watts knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing it anyway. That crack in the mask should have been a warning, a moment to stop, to reassess, to perhaps finally attempt living with some semblance of the authenticity he'd spent decades telling others to pursue. Instead, Watts doubled down. The late 1960s brought him an entirely new audience, one that would catapult him to a level of fame he'd never experienced before. The counterculture movement, the hippies, the young Americans dropping out of conventional society and seeking alternative ways of understanding consciousness and existence. They adopted Alan Watts as a patron saint. His lectures were passed around on bootleg recordings. His books became Bibles for a generation, experimenting with psychedelics and Eastern philosophy. And Watts, now in his 50s, saw not a spiritual movement, but a commercial opportunity that was simply too lucrative to ignore. He began touring relentlessly. College campuses, community centers, outdoor festivals where thousands of young people would gather to hear the man who seemed to understand what they were searching for. His fees increased dramatically. Speaking engagements that once paid a few $100s were now commanding thousands. He hired an assistant, a young man named Jack, who handled logistics, bookings, travel arrangements. Jack was efficient, devoted, and according to several people close to Watts during this period, something more than just an employee. Their relationship, whatever its exact nature, was kept carefully hidden. Not because Watts had any particular moral objection to it, but because it didn't fit the image. The guru of Eastern wisdom couldn't afford scandals that might threaten the revenue stream. Meanwhile, back in Connecticut, Dorothy was struggling to raise for teenagers on sporadic child support payments that Watts would often simply forget to send. Court documents from this period show repeated filings for unpaid support, missed payments that accumulated into thousands of dollars of debt. When confronted by lawyers, Watts would express confusion, even indignation. "I'm teaching the world about compassion," he reportedly said during one hearing. "Surely that has value that transcends monetary obligation." The judge was not moved. Neither were his children, who were learning that their father's compassion apparently had very specific geographic and demographic limitations. Joan, his eldest daughter from his first marriage, now in her 30s, sent a letter in 1967 that biographers would later describe as devastating in its simple honesty. "You've written entire books about being a present father," she wrote. "You've given lectures about the importance of authentic relationships. When are you going to actually be my father? Not the famous Alan Watts, not the philosopher, just my dad. Do you even know where I live? Do you know what I do for work? Do you know anything about my life that isn't filtered through newspaper clippings about your achievements?" There's no record of Watts ever responding to that letter, but there is record of him giving a lecture that same month, to a packed auditorium, about the importance of genuine human connection. His private writings from this period, manuscripts and journals that wouldn't be published until decades after his death, reveal a man in profound psychological distress, depression that he self-medicated with alcohol, moments of genuine self-hatred, of recognizing the gap between what he taught and how he lived. "I am a fraud," he wrote in one journal entry from 1960. "I have become precisely what I warned others against becoming, a performer of spirituality rather than a practitioner of it. And the worst part is, I cannot stop. The performance has become who I am. There is no authentic Alan Watts underneath this mask. The mask has eaten everything else." These are not the words of a man at peace. These are the words of someone trapped in a performance they can no longer escape, even in private. His health began to deteriorate visibly. Decades of heavy drinking were taking their toll. He developed heart problems, digestive issues, persistent fatigue. Doctors recommended he stop drinking entirely, warned him that continuing would be fatal. Watts refused. "I'd rather die authentically," he told friends, "than live as a version of myself I don't recognize." The irony of this statement, coming from a man who spent his entire adult life being a version of himself he deliberately constructed for public consumption, seemed entirely lost on him. Or perhaps it wasn't lost at all. Perhaps that's what made it so unbearable. Mary, his third wife, had endured more than a decade of this by the early 1970s. The drinking, the affairs, the financial chaos, the emotional absence. But the final breaking point came when she discovered him with Helen, yet another young follower who'd been attending his workshops. This time, Mary didn't demand explanation or reformation. She simply filed for divorce. No dramatic confrontations. No attempts at reconciliation. Just a quiet, final acknowledgement that the man she'd married existed only in lectures and books, never in their actual home. Their daughter Diane, now a teenager, barely knew her father, except as a voice on recordings, and a figure who occasionally appeared between tours, smelling of wine, and speaking in the same performative cadence he used with strangers. By 1973, Watts was living alone on a houseboat in Sausalito, still giving lectures when his health permitted, still writing when he could focus through the fog of alcohol and depression, still cashing checks from publishers and event organizers, but increasingly isolated, increasingly aware that he built a magnificent career on principles he never actually managed to live by, and running out of time to figure out if that mattered, or if the teachings could somehow be valid even when the teacher was entirely fraudulent. The houseboat became both refuge and prison, a floating isolation chamber where Watts could avoid the accumulating consequences of decades, of choices that had prioritized image over integrity, performance over presence, reputation over relationship. Friends who visited during those final months describe a man who'd aged far beyond his 68 years. The charismatic lecturer was gone. The carefully cultivated persona had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. What remained was someone who seemed almost relieved to no longer have to maintain the performance, even as he recognized how completely that performance had consumed his actual life. November of 1973 arrived, cold and gray over Sausalito Bay. Watts' heart condition had worsened significantly. He'd refused hospitalization, refused the medical interventions that might have extended his life. Not because of any philosophical commitment to natural death, but because, as he told one of the few friends still in contact, he was simply tired. Tired of the act. Tired of the contradiction. Tired of being Alan Watts. On November 16th, his heart finally gave out. The official cause listed cardiac complications, which was technically accurate, but told only the smallest fraction of the truth. The fuller truth involved decades of substance dependency, years of ignoring medical advice, and the cumulative physical toll of a life lived in profound misalignment with every principle he declaimed to embody. None of his 7 children were present when he passed. Not because they weren't notified, but because several of them had stopped maintaining regular contact years earlier. The emotional cost of having a father who existed primarily as a public figure, who could eloquently discuss unconditional love to strangers while being functionally absent from his own family, had simply become too high. Joan, his eldest, would learn about his passing from a newspaper obituary. Mark and Tina heard through a phone call from their mother Dorothy. Diane, his youngest, was informed by a lawyer handling estate matters. The geographic and emotional distance that Watts had maintained from his children meant that even his death became just another event they processed from afar. Like reading about a famous person they'd never actually met. The will, when it was read, delivered one final betrayal. The bulk of his estate, including royalties from his numerous books that would continue generating substantial income for decades, went not to his children but to Helen, the woman he'd been involved with when Mary filed for divorce. His 7 children received minimal bequests, token amounts that seemed almost deliberately insulting given the commercial success of his work. Anne, one of his middle daughters, would later reflect in an interview, "He sold enlightenment and wisdom to millions of people. He made a fortune teaching others how to live authentically and love unconditionally. And his own children got the scraps." That tells you everything you need to know about the distance between what he preached and who he actually was. But here's where the story becomes truly complicated. Truly uncomfortable for anyone seeking simple moral conclusions. Because Alan Watts' books continue to sell. His lectures continue to be discovered by new generations, seeking meaning and perspective. His explanations of Eastern philosophy remain genuinely accessible and, for many people, genuinely helpful. Thousands of individuals have written testimonials about how his work helped them through difficult periods, opened their minds to new ways of thinking, provided comfort during times of existential crisis. The teachings, divorced from the teacher, seem to function perfectly well. Perhaps even better, without the context of how contradictory his personal life actually was. This creates an almost unbearable philosophical question. If the messenger is fraudulent, does that invalidate the message? If someone teaches profound truths while living in complete opposition to those truths, are the truths any less true? Can wisdom be authentic even when the person speaking it is performing rather than embodying it? Watts himself might have appreciated the paradox. The man who spent his life explaining the illusion of the ego, the constructed nature of the self, ended up being perhaps the most elaborate construction of all. A self that existed almost entirely for public consumption, that had no private reality that matched its public presentation. That was all mask and no face underneath. The historical record doesn't let us escape into comfortable narratives here. Alan Watts was neither pure saint nor pure villain. He was something more human and more troubling than either extreme. A gifted communicator who genuinely understood complex philosophy but couldn't translate that understanding into lived experience. A man who helped millions while failing the people closest to him. A teacher whose greatest lesson might be the one he never intended to teach. That eloquence about wisdom is not the same as wisdom itself. That understanding principles intellectually is entirely different from living them. And that the gap between who we present ourselves as being and who we actually are can become so wide that we disappear into it completely. This chapter of philosophical history deserves examination, not to tear down a figure or defend him, but to understand the full complexity of what happens when spiritual teaching becomes performance, when ancient wisdom becomes commercial product, when the role of guru becomes more important than the reality underneath the role. Alan Watts wanted to be remembered as the man who brought Eastern wisdom to the West. He'll likely be remembered as something far more complicated. A cautionary tale about the dangers of mistaking articulate performance for authentic transformation.